Hello everybody, my name is Gareth. I'm from WBR Insights, so I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Data in the Age of GDPR. We have a great panel of speakers for you today, but before I hand over to them, I'd like to take you through a few housekeeping items. The windows that you can see in front of you in the platform are customizable, so you can drag and drop them wherever you like. If you do minimize one for any reason, you can relaunch it from the bar at the bottom of the screen, so it's not lost. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the main presentation where you can submit your questions to the panelists. So we'll be collecting those questions throughout the webinar, so feel free to submit them as soon as they pop into your mind. Don't have to worry about waiting to the end of the webinar to submit questions. And I will be on hand throughout in the background. If you do have any technical issues, you can send us a message, and all of that can be done via the Q&A window, which you can see on your screen. So that's your portal for getting in touch with us, either for any technical issues or to submit a question, as I said previously. So I'd like to now introduce the panelists for today, Barbara Lawler and John O'Keefe. Barbara Lawler is Looker's Chief Privacy and Data Ethics Officer and is a globally recognized privacy leader with an extensive track record in shaping the thinking of US and global policymakers on data policy issues. Prior to working with Looker, she served as Chief Privacy Officer both at Intuit and Hewlett-Packard, where she led the global implementation of privacy and ethical data innovation strategies. John O'Keefe is Looker's Vice President of EMEA. He joined Looker in January 2017 to lead the company's growth and expansion across the region. Prior to Looker, John served as the head of EMEA for Nitro and took the lead for Salesforce.com's SMB and commercial business in Europe. So that is all as far as introductions are concerned. So now I'd like to hand over to you, Barbara and John.
Great, thanks, Gareth.
Thank you, Gareth.
So I want to move on to the webinar overview. So what we're going to be looking at today is on the next slide here. So first of all, Barbara's going to walk you through the last 12 months, I suppose, since GDPR was introduced, and then just talking a little bit more about the evolving mindsets and data ethics. And I'm going to talk a little more about how is the market reacting to GDPR. And we're going to then look at some of the guiding principles and GDPR best practices. And then Barbara's going to finish off with what's around the corner in 2019. And then, of course, as Gareth mentioned, we're happy to answer any questions as well. So that's the overview. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for being here today on the webinar. First, where I wanted to start is to give everyone a sense of the impact of GDPR over the last year. It has been a tremendously busy year, both for companies in preparing and then implementing and responding to GDPR-related issues, but also regulators throughout Europe also spent an extensive amount of time and resources to prepare for the actual implementation date of GDPR now just over a year ago. Many of those regulators actually saw a significant increase in staff and resources, but as we'll hear, those frankly paled in comparison to the influx of inquiries, complaints, breach notifications, DPO registrations, and requests for consultations. So when we think about what are kind of the primary drivers right now that we're seeing is absolutely clearly for organizations, security and privacy are now front of mind. We see this in how vendors and sub-processors are being evaluated. Virtually every company, vendor, sub-processor is being asked detailed questions up front at the beginning of the sales process about your security posture, data handling activities, what happens from data collection through storage through disposal. We're seeing more and more that security and privacy are not just front of mind, but actually front of and becoming much more integrated with business operations. And it's proven to be an opportunity to modernize. And we see this in a focus on data governance, understanding what data you have, why you have it, and if you don't need it, actually removing it. So it's an opportunity to simplify, to consolidate. And it's also an opportunity for a way to think about new ways to modernize your approach to data handling overall and metrics and reporting for privacy compliance. We're seeing businesses seeing the opportunity to differentiate around privacy and data protection practices, and that in more and more cases, GDPR readiness, the ability to respond to those really probing questions about data handling and security practices can accelerate the sales process. At the very least, GDPR readiness doesn't slow the sales process down the way non-GDPR readiness might. And we're seeing increased interest at the board level for reporting. So it's been a year. What's happened? We've seen a lot of guidance from regulators. We've seen intense scrutiny of some data handling practices, and this shows up in the activity and reports, complaints, and guidance so far that we've seen from regulators across the European Union. There is a significant focus on ad tech and big technology. We've seen a lot of investigations. We've got some data for you to share in just a moment about that, but complaint handling, inquiries, consultations, all not just on the rise, but really in significant and dramatic numbers that I think even the regulators, quite frankly, didn't anticipate. But it speaks to the awareness of the general population, not just in a business sense, but in a citizen, data subject, and consumer sense as well. Enforcement, what we've seen so far are what I would say is deceptively modest enforcement, focused on issues that have arisen out of complaints, but in some cases actually initiated by regulators. And I would bucket these in the category of security basics and privacy basics. Things like having notice for CCTV cameras, security basic practices like making sure that credentials aren't in clear text, that databases aren't open for anyone to access on the internet. And we see classic privacy issues, which you could say is in the don't annoy me category, which speaks to telemarketing and sales and so on. So just a little bit of thinking about both how I think about data protection and privacy, as does Looker. I've been in data protection and privacy for 20 years now, and what I've seen over the years is that companies that focus on doing privacy and data protection right absolutely can demonstrate not just that at the compliance level, but at a real business differentiator and strategic differentiator. What we're also seeing is more than just compliance is this fundamental question of what's the right thing to do with data. GDPR has extensive requirements, a lot of fairly procedure requirements, both on the back end as well as what we see in the sales process as it relates to contracting, extensive due diligence into the details of data handling, security processes, whether it's incident management, access controls, and beyond. But what we're seeing out of both the European Data Protection Board, led by Giovanni Butarelli, as well as other thought leaders in Europe and beyond, is this focus on data ethics, to ask that question, what's the right thing to do, not just for the company and your bottom line, but what's important and what matters for citizens and consumers, and what are government and regulatory agencies looking at. It's that what's the right thing to do question beyond checking the box on compliance. Oh, wrong way. So one of the things that we're seeing, and this is what I'm going to share next, is some survey data that actually took place in late December, but I think it's indicative about how individuals, consumers, and citizens are thinking about protecting privacy. And so here's some interesting numbers. I think a few years ago, if you had asked individuals in Europe, in the United States and beyond, if they were taking any action to protect their data and their privacy, you would have gotten fairly modest response and fairly modest numbers. But I think what's significant about this particular set of survey results is the number of individuals and the basic things that we all as individuals can do to protect our data, to protect our privacy. Notably, changing the privacy settings on your applications, on your smartphones, on the websites that you visit, including something as simple as changing location tracking, turning it off when you don't need to have it on. But we also see activity around accepting cookies, declining actual terms in some cases. One of my favorite things that I like to advise is if you go through your smartphone and if there's a mobile app that you haven't used in 6 months to a year, it's probably a good idea just to delete that. Unless it's something for that once-a-year trip to Disneyland or Disney World, you can probably go ahead and delete that app. Just simplifies all the data that's around around your phone. Some individuals are more and more aggressive about deleting or inactivating their social media accounts. And some are actually reducing use of social media, which obviously has strong implications. So moving on. Oh, we've got that slide twice, just because we wanted to make sure that you had another chance to think about that. Okay, all right. Now, what do the complaints look like? Really, really interesting data when you look at this. This is from a report released by the European Union Commission late last week on the anniversary of GDPR. And what we see is hundreds of thousands of complaints around data protection and privacy issues. Over 144,000. In addition, another 89,000 data breach notifications. And so this was as of early May. What are the top issues that we're seeing? We're seeing telemarketing. So remember when I mentioned that there were these kind of privacy fundamentals about don't annoy me? Telemarketing and unwanted email definitely fall into that category. Kind of surprisingly, reactions around CCTV and video surveillance cameras. But what we also see, and this varies by country, is that there are a number of complaints about the inability to access data. So data access rights are a really important part of GDPR and something that you should be ready for, be able to respond to, and within that 30-day window. We do see complaints about profiling and ad tech, and that's kind of its own set of analyses and investigations. One of the things that kind of buried a little bit under this material is when you look at the volume, and even though companies had 2 years to prepare, the regulators had 2 years to prepare, and had a lot more resources, it was nowhere near enough to respond to the volume. There was a quote from a regulator in Germany a few months ago that said, basically, we will get to your complaint and we may be able to acknowledge it within 2 or 3 months. So when we see what feels like a slow ramp up of enforcement activity, that speaks as much to the staffing and resourcing that regulators throughout the European Union actually have in place to respond to what really is a flood of complaints and notices. Not every complaint actually speaks to a problem in violation of the GDPR, but it speaks to a complaint regarding some type of data handling practice. So companies' mindsets are really evolving. There's kind of a battle publicly and privately about consumer trust. And I think that really speaks to the importance of asking that data ethics question, which is, what's the right thing to do with data as it relates to my data subjects, my consumers, citizens in the European Union? More than anything, GDPR is about enhancing and changing and broadening your data culture to that end-to-end data governance approach so that you know what data you have, why you have it, how long you're going to keep it, and how you plan to dispose of it. More and more the emphasis that you want to build privacy in, not bolt it on, that it's a part of business processes, part of product development, And that's everything from when products are released, services are offered, and when those services or products are discontinued. And it's important to remember, and we see this manifested in the number of complaints, that even where there aren't complaints, that acquiescence, this idea that consumers, individuals just sort of give in and acknowledge and move on, doesn't mean that there's always trust. So it's important to remember that strong data protection and privacy practices absolutely equal trust. The other effect that GDPR has had is the evolving mindset around what it takes to be an international player in the world of data protection and privacy. So you'll see kind of a map as we see the influence of GDPR and GDPR-like thinking. And this is true everywhere from Japan, which has earned the coveted designation as adequate with GDPR, the APPI. We see effective next year in Brazil, the law for general privacy and data protection. We see moving through the National Congress in Argentina, the data protection law, waiting for treatment by that National Congress. In the United States, we see an early pre-GDPR compliance date manifestation in Privacy Shield. We see consistent debate in the U.S. Congress about what a national framework for data protection and privacy should look like. That's going to take a long time to go into place. Anyone who's looking for U.S.-based privacy regulation to be passed by the end of this year is probably being overly optimistic. Where we have seen substantive activity is in the state of California in the far western United States. That's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It goes into effect next January and is truly inspired by the GDPR. It doesn't have the same policy and theoretical foundations, however, as GDPR. So it adopts concepts like access, retention, deletion requirements, the individual to request deletion, but in a truly different and sort of California way. So for those who are GDPR ready and thinking that CCPA is equivalent to GDPR, it's definitely not. That is not this webinar. That's probably another webinar, but I would encourage you to follow up and see where there are differences between GDPR and CCPA. So now I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to talk about how the market's reacting to all of this. John.
Thanks, Barb. That's great. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to walk you through a few trends, I suppose, that we at Looker, but also our partners and our customers are seeing in the market over the last number of years. I suppose the first trend that we're really seeing is that everybody needs data. And this is quite interesting, both, I think, from a personal / consumer perspective, but also very much a business perspective. And I suppose if you think about it, on a personal level, we expect data wherever we may be, maybe when we're shopping online, for example, and ordering any products, for example, and looking at reviews and tracking where those products are in terms of shipping and so on. Or maybe it's a case that, you use different applications on your phone, for example. Maybe, for example, you're a runner, you're a cyclist, you're using Strava, you're using Garmin and Connect, for example. Then guess what? That's all data. You're looking at your average pace, you're looking at, elevation, so on and so forth. So it's all data, and that's what you expect on a day-to-day basis. And also it can happen when that data is being used to help determine what you should watch, for example, on Netflix or whatever it is. So, when data is all around us at a personal level, then guess what? It's no surprise that those same people are going into the workforce looking for and hungry for that data as well. That's going to help them drive their business and drive their decision making and so on. So again, there's new positions that are being created in these companies, whether it's different analysts, for example, for different functions, whether it's sales or revenue, for example, or there might be DevOps engineers, growth hackers, and so on. But also, I suppose that brings us on in terms of, yes, there's a lot of data, but where is that coming from in a business perspective? And I think in a business perspective, one of the trends that we're really seeing is actually in the proliferation of SaaS applications. And I think this is quite interesting in itself. So what we're seeing there, I suppose, is that we have a number of applications that are being designed for different business functions, whether it's for sales, whether it's for customer service, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that in itself is great, but it actually creates different silos of data in the organization. And this isn't going to go away. This is actually, in fact, is going to Forrester, actually IDC, I think it was, actually released some information and data around this last year, whereby 500 million new business applications are going to be created over the next 5 years. So it's not going to get any better from that perspective. There's going to be continued silos of data in your organization. But also, things like we're seeing infrastructure, and the infrastructure has evolved over the last number of years in particular, whereby I suppose what we're seeing is that databases, first of all, are bigger, they're faster, and actually cheaper as well, for that matter. We're also seeing in relation to infrastructure a shift from ETL processes, so extraction, transformation, loading processes, to an extraction, loading and transformation, so ELT. And that's something that's just making, simplifying, I suppose, the collation of data and loading of that data into these larger and more modern databases. And so with that, I suppose what we're all, to sort of address that as well, one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a cloud databases of, one of the things that Gartner, for example, are saying is that 75% of all databases will be cloud by 2023. So that brings us on to a point and example, right? So what this is interesting is to see is a little bit more about one of our customers, for example, who's a telco, a large telco customer. And I think from this perspective, what they wanted to do, I suppose, is to almost address some of those trends, whereby they wanted to provide all of their employees, or as many of their employees, access to the data. And so therefore they actually made their data available and provided self-service analytics to their analytical database, and essentially gave full access to that database. However, this did cause a major issue, and that was around keeping track of where that data was going, because ultimately, I suppose, one of the legal requirements of GDPR is that there is an audit trail in case a data breach does happen. So that was a major concern for them. So therefore, they decided, okay, they needed to go and actually identify a solution to this problem. So in that case, they wanted to be able to still give their analysts and their employees access to their data, and real-time access for that matter, but in a governed and very auditable manner as well, for that matter. So therefore, they brought Looker into as part of their solution to this. And why did they introduce Looker? There's probably a couple of key aspects to this. First of all, I suppose we have an in-database architecture. So what that really means is that Looker as a data platform connects directly to your database. And that allows you then to have that more governed environment through the data modeling layer that Looker provides. Not only that, but we also provide usage tracking functionality. So therefore, you're able to track exactly what queries are being asked by your analysts or by your employees. And then this in itself then led to the ability for this customer to be able to track exactly what was going on and to audit, for example, what was being queried. But also going back to, I suppose, that concern around data and the fact that it might be leaving your organization and so on and so forth. So Looker eliminates the need of extracting data because it is in database. And this, again, is something that's really interesting from a perspective that you don't necessarily want to have data leaving the organization, maybe being downloaded onto your employees' laptops and causing risks associated to all of that. So I suppose ultimately what was the impact of all this for the customer? Ultimately, it was a combination of having a platform in Looker as a data platform, but also having, I suppose, the processes and having people being able to adapt and apply those processes. Ultimately, in minimizing risk, but also maximizing business impact. So this is interesting, but that, but also what we're seeing, I suppose, is that there is an opportunity for growth here, right? So one of the things that we're seeing from whatever a survey that was done recently was that 69% of our of organizations do not consider themselves data driven. So if you stop and think about that for a little minute, then what are people doing if they don't feel their organizations are not data driven? Are they making up their own rules for that matter? Are they analyzing data that they feel is appropriate and therefore downloading and extracting data and so on and so forth onto their laptops and doing their own analysis? What does that mean for your organization? What exposure or risk does that mean for you? And one of the things to support that, I suppose, is that Forrester identified 66% of companies still use Excel for the majority of their BI. So that in itself is probably really interesting from a risk perspective, and how do you actually alleviate that? So with GDPR, there still is a confusion around this in relation to what can we be doing in terms of changes of approaches, driving for compliance, the fear of fines, so on and so forth. So all of the stuff that Marva has already relayed. These are the sort of the key things that have been top of mind for C-level folks in lots of different organizations. And I suppose one of the things just to highlight here for you guys as well is that to help break down some of these complex regulatory requirements, Barbara has kindly written a white paper which does include a very useful checklist as well, and you can find that at looker.com/GDPR paper. So I would definitely recommend that for you. So moving on to the next slide, some of the guiding principles and GDPR best practices. Maybe just good to take a moment just to sort of reflect, I suppose, where we're at now, having been 20 minutes or so into the webinar. So onto the guiding principles for the future. One of the things, obviously we talk about data-driven workforce. People, yes, need data, but not only do they need access to data, they need to be able to have actionable and useful insights. In the same way as they have insights, as you say, on a personal basis or a consumer basis, they need to have that in their businesses as well. But not only that, they need to have it in a trusted environment. There's a rise of SaaS applications that we mentioned. So again, what does this mean? It means that there's obviously lots of data silos out there because of the fact that this data is residing in these different data SaaS applications and so on. But as you said, modern data warehouses are becoming a thing. Modern cloud databases, in particular, are becoming very, very, very prevalent in organizations of all sizes, for that matter. And one of the benefits, I suppose, or key benefits of that is going to be around cost. It's going to be around scalability, and also in terms of speed as well. So this brings us on to, I suppose, what does this mean in relation to GDPR, data governance, and where does Looker help you from that perspective? I suppose first of all, it is to do with people, right? As I said a while ago, people want to have access to a trusted environment. They want to be able to have that in real time, and therefore that's where Looker comes in as part of that solution, is that we give and provide this governed environment. Second one is around processes, and again, as part of the GDPR. It's important to be able to standardize and simplify how that data is processed. And again, this is where Looker's data stack, architecture, and ecosystem really help enable companies to adopt and apply those processes. And then finally, I suppose, it's around technologies. And again, we talked about multiple applications. We talked about lots of different databases that are out there. So again, it's a matter of how Looker allows you to better understand, I suppose, the transfer of those data to different third-party systems as well. So ultimately, one of the key benefits of Looker when it comes to GDPR is taking that data that is prevalent across your whole organization, whether it's in SaaS applications, whether it's in different databases, and so on. And I suppose on the left-hand side, you'll see what a typical environment might look like in an organization, whereby all that data is being moved into lots of different extracts into different cubes, lots of multiple processes, and so on and so forth. With that, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of complexity. And ultimately, on the right-hand side, where Looker helps a lot of our customers is ultimately is being able to, first of all, I suppose, taking that data from lots of different sources and being able to use one of those modern databases or cloud databases or SQL compliant database and ultimately centralizing that data in one single data environment. And then Looker ultimately is a data platform. And that sits on top of that database or that data warehouse. And using Looker's data modeling layer, you're able to really define what your data and what your dimensions and your metrics and so on and so forth looks like for your organization, whether you're in sales or whether you're marketing or finance and so on and so forth. And being able to use that data to analyze whatever you wish to analyze that across different functions for that matter. But again, in a very governed environment, but also allowing to have those actionable insights. And you can do that. You can deliver it, obviously, through the web, maybe embedded environments, for example, or maybe through the API as well of Looker. So that brings me on to one of the last points around monitoring and auditing. So I suppose, first of all, around accountability, that having the ability to monitor and to review different data logs, for example, able to have access to lots of different data ultimately helps maintain the integrity of your organization by establishing greater accountability. In terms of reducing data sprawl, we mentioned a while ago around keeping data off the laptops and the fact that Looker is in database, so it's connecting directly to your database, then this minimizes the need for extracts and data being downloaded onto different laptops within your organization, because ultimately that will obviously have an impact in terms of auditing and capability of identifying where your data is located. And then finally, real-time alerts and in terms of notifications and so on. Really, one of the things that you want to do is be able to respond quickly to any potential data breaches as part of the GDPR regulations. And with that, Looker can really help assist, I suppose, in identifying not only the source, but also the scope and maybe the breadth of that potential data breach as well. So in order to helping you to report anything to regulators and so on and so forth as well. So that's a really important aspect of Looker in relation to GDPR. So that means I'm finished my section. So back to you again, Barbara.
Thank you, John. One thing that I would add to what you were just describing is we're starting to see some companies also use Looker to actually help with their compliance reporting, including all the way up to the board level. So as we think about the power of that data platform, the ability to create metrics and dashboards, not only for compliance reporting, but even board level reporting, that's something I think that we'll see more of over the next, as GDPR continues to grow and expand in terms of its influence in 2019 and beyond. So what are we going to see through the rest of the year? Just late last week, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or IPP, published a report, GDPR at 1 year, and that takes input from some of the leading regulators across the European Union, Austria, Ireland, France, and the UK. And what was especially notable about that report was the depth and breadth of the work that's happening that's not always visible to all of us, whether we're on the business side or acting as consumers, but what the regulators are actually doing. So I think taking Ireland as a snapshot, in the first year of GDPR, the Irish Data Protection Commission received nearly 2,900 complaints, which, while it was actually closer to prior pre-GDPR years, the focus has definitely been different, particularly around access rights as we think about them under GDPR, the right of the individual to request access to, a copy of, the ability to port, the ability to request deletion, including the right to be forgotten where that actually fits into play. We know that Looker can help you find where your data is, so that's an important aspect to consider when we think about what then is required to actually respond to those access rights that the regulators are following up on complaints. We see complaints about unfair processing. The idea is data is being used in a way that is unexpected, seems unfair, or perhaps unlawful. There's a big focus, interestingly, on unfair disclosure, which really speaks to where are all the other sub-processors or other organizations as part of a data ecosystem involved. Separately, there were over 3,500 data breach notifications. So this speaks more to the pure data protection and security requirement. And here again, we see unauthorized disclosures of data. So that's an area that companies should be focusing on, both in terms of data governance, but whether you're using tools like Looker in complement with strong security practices and controls. Security in its purest form will continue to be a strong focus and accelerated focus for regulators. One thing to note is that of those breach notifications, several related to software bugs in products and technology. And of those, that was reflected in 11 multinational organizations. So well-known brands weren't mentioned in the report, but we can imagine what some of those might be. Additionally, the DPC is in process of over 52 formal statutory inquiries. Some of those are initiated by the office herself. Others are driven by complaints. They are very broad in scope. 18 involve large technology, multinational organizations. So when we think about, again, what's going to happen through the rest of 2019 and really into 2020 is not just an acceleration, but a greater emphasis and greater transparency about the nature of those inquiries, the breadth of them, and how those will impact the rights of individuals across the European Union. And as we see those investigations and inquiries reach their conclusion sometime in the next year, I think those who are thinking there's not been enough enforcement yet in year one of GDPR will see that year one of GDPR was really racing down the runway, and we're going to see that plane take off with a number of conclusions to these inquiries that will provide additional requirements for companies to be considering. So there will be more coming, absolutely, when it comes to that. More guidance, what are the expected practices? How does one actually apply GDPR in very specific industries, verticals, data uses? We'll see continued emphasis on ad tech and what it means to be profiled, particularly in the very large, complex ecosystem that advertising technology has in place. We should look for guidance also. So it's not just that there will be a lot more public conclusions about the many investigations and statutory inquiries, but we'll actually see guidance. So for example, the DPC Technology Unit plans to release guidance over the next year for companies on best practices for artificial intelligence, for advertising technology, best practices for device ID settings and location tracking, and also importantly for cybersecurity. The DPC, of course, is not alone. Every EU regulator in different countries are focusing on different areas of how to apply GDPR in an extensive and robust way. So we see the ICO in the UK also focusing on ad tech, but more in the marketplace, including real-time bidding, which is very controversial right now. We'll see a code of practice for anonymization come out over the next year. In France, we'll see the CNIL provide guidance for startups, which we think is very important because startups, smaller companies, more data-centric, can build in privacy and data governance from the ground up. So we'll look forward to seeing what the French have to offer. Additionally, if you are in a business that focuses on young people and children, look for the European Data Protection Board and the European Supervisor to provide guidance around children's data. an important area where the data is very sensitive. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to cover today. And as we think about and take questions from the audience at this point, one of the things that I would just close with, and John, maybe you want to chime in as well, is what we're seeing is that organizations benefit from investment in privacy and data protection for GDPR compliance and beyond, and that has a net positive impact on the sales cycle. This is starting to show up in research studies about the impact. And so let's open it up to questions. But John, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add here about how you're seeing GDPR impact the sales process, and if that's slowing things down, accelerating, or maybe a mix of both.
Yeah, it's a great question, Barbara. I think, yeah, it's a bit of both, to be perfectly honest with you. I think, of course, when something like GDPR is introduced, then that, as per the slides, I suppose, there is some confusion, and that obviously then transfers, I suppose, to any evaluation of any technology for that matter, and obviously that can have an impact on sales cycles for companies like Looker, right? Or for any technology company for that matter. But I suppose in our case, what it has helped us, right? And as per the slide there, in relation to one of our customers, what they were looking for is that sort of more governed environment, but also having the flexibility of having self-service analytics, but in that kind of trusted environment. So I think that's something that has helped us in many ways compared to other BI solutions.
Excellent. So, Gareth, I think we might be turning over to you to see what questions we have from the audience.
Hi, guys. Thanks very much for that. Yeah. So just a word to the audience. If you haven't had time to submit your question for the Q&A just yet, then now's the time. Just enter it in the Q&A window there. So let's see some of the questions we've got here. What I'll do is I'll just pitch this question, and then Barbara or John, you can feel free to jump in if you feel you can speak to it. In terms of investment, and particularly investment in startups in the EU since the introduction of GDPR, has there been any impact there?
Do you want to take that, Barb?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, that we've definitely seen some impact, and I think it just becomes a matter of kind of going back to the basics around governance, and I like to start with data flow charts, and we didn't talk about that yet, but that is certainly something that Looker, the product or technology, can help with, but really having a fundamental understanding and documenting exactly where your data is, and that's all data sources, that's all of the input to your data sources, and then all of the places it's going outside of the company. I think that's often something that's not as well understood as I think we all as business people would like to think.
Right. Yeah. Thanks very much for that. And let's see, we're having a number of questions coming through now. Let's just get on to the next one here. So in terms of what are the best ways to ensure that data is being properly handled across a business?
Well, I'll take that one again, and I think just building on what I was saying before, I think the challenge for organizations it goes back to that fundamental, which is what are your products and services, what are your business processes? And so let's take an example of human resources, which is if you think about individuals that a company has about its employees, often that information starts with a job applicant, and then as that applicant may go through the initial assessment process and becomes a formal candidate for a particular role. And so you may have a number of systems or databases where information about that person resides, which can be a recruiting system. It can be your email and calendaring systems. If you're using video conference, if you're using site check-in services where visitors log in, that those are all just the start of then when an employee receives an offer, and then what is contained in that offer, and is that information then now in a new HRIS system, and what is in that HRIS system, and then adding benefits. And the benefits providers are typically going to be third-party organizations. So when we think about that particular example and really going through and identifying the business process that the different data sources and databases support, then being able to actually literally create a diagram for that, and there are a number of tools you can do that, everything from whiteboard and pen and paper to we're starting to see some more automated tools, specifically in the privacy management and privacy platform space, that will help companies automate that along with having a tool and technology like Looker in place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's move on to the next question. What do you consider to be some of the pros and cons of a bottom-up approach to data security focused on culture and educating employees, consumers, rather than forcing broad requirements on organizations?
Boy, that is a big question. That actually, in some ways, to me, speaks to, I'm going to use an analogy here, which is if you think of a sandwich, and so you have tops-down requirements that are broad and comprehensive, as you see in GDPR and in other data protection frameworks. So that's the top-down. Then you have the bottoms-up. And I would argue that top-down includes culture and values, and that security is part of a culture in terms of everything from administrator controls, who has access to data and for what purpose, having actual role-based access defined by function, sometimes down to the individual role. It depends upon the nature of the organization. Providing training and awareness training. Anti-phishing training is especially important right now. That's one of the most significant attack vectors for organizations are phishing and targeted spear phishing attacks. That bottoms-up effort about building it in, though, to product and processes. And so, to me, those meet in the middle, and you have your nice security sandwich, which is tops-down requirements, bottom-up. So it's not an either-or, it's an and. What is helpful about the GDPR, although it calls out a phrase that sometimes gives CISOs pause, considering state-of-the-art. But when we consider state-of-the-art of everything from cyber criminals to other cyber attackers to perhaps not having as strong controls internally as you'd like, GDPR contemplates the focus around what's the appropriate security level for the nature of the processing and the type of data being processed. And that's actually intended to allow organizations, not just the security organization, but a company to identify the appropriate security practices, technologies, and controls to meet those requirements.
Just, Barb, very great points. I think the other thing that is probably important to highlight, I suppose, is the size of company as well, right? So one of the things that we're seeing is, it's if you're a large company, then maybe you have the resources internally to be able to manage a lot of this, right, in terms of data security, in terms of how the processes behind it, the communication around it, so on and so forth. Now, of course, that comes with far more complexity than a smaller company. But I think in a smaller company, you don't necessarily have those resources and so on and so forth as well. So I think there is no right or wrong answer to this, but I think it's just something to highlight, I think, in terms of the size of a company and the resources they have available to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that you make a very strong point. And sometimes small companies still have very complex data processing and sensitive data environments. So it can be a real challenge. When we look at the enforcement activities early on, I think that's a flag of where at a basic level companies should be focusing. And these are basic access controls, which I've mentioned. It's also making sure that your databases, user credentials, those types of things are appropriately protected. And these are security basics. They're not even specific to GDPR. They're reflected in every security standard, whether it's the ISO 27001 standard, SOC 2 standards, the NIST standards coming out of the United States or others.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. We've got a question here. I think this one may be to you, John, best of all. What's the data architecture for Looker?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I suppose we touched on it a little bit earlier on, in the sense that obviously Looker is a data platform that sits on centralized centralized database typically. So I suppose if you look at it from the bottom up, first and foremost, obviously you have all these different data sources. So we mentioned SaaS applications, for example, but you could also have data residing in lots of other databases and so on, or other systems. So again, what we use is, I suppose we have, I mentioned ELT. So ELT is extraction, loading, and transformation partners, and essentially their partners are companies who can take that, collate that data, have the connectors already built in to connect to a Salesforce or a Zendesk or to NetSuite or whatever it might be, and be able to take that data from those systems and essentially load it into a cloud database or a SQL compliant database, whether that's a Google BigQuery, for example, or a Snowflake or Amazon Redshift, or maybe a Postgres, for example, or one of those type of databases. And once you have extracted a load of that data into one of those databases, or any SQL compliant database, then essentially Looker is that data platform that sits on top of that database. And within Looker, then that's where you have a data modeling layer. I suppose that's where ultimately where you can describe, I suppose, the data and the different fields or dimensions and different metrics for your end users, so that they can have a more I suppose curated experience as an end user and in terms of self-service analytics. And then through the data platform of Looker, you can then expose that data and allow it to be analyzed in whatever manner you want by your end users, whether it could be, as I said, on the web, for example, through the application, through Looker, or maybe, for example, maybe you build your own applications and maybe embed data into those applications for it to be analyzed by either customers, for example, or partners, or whoever it might be, for example. But also you may want to use the Looker API to be able to, I suppose, integrate that data with other systems, for example, as well. So again, it's all within the Looker data platform.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, we were having a number of questions coming through, which is really great. I just want to say, if we don't manage to get a chance to address the question live, then we will have the guys follow up with you afterwards. I think we can fit in a couple more though. So a question here, have supervising authorities started imposing penalties, or is the trend more to providing guidance and allowing companies to comply?
Right now what we're seeing around both penalties and guidance is it's a little bit of both. I think what we're going to see over the next year is a lot more of both, and if anything, more on the guidance side. I think at least what the pragmatic regulators are looking at is what they really want to encourage is compliance. And to use that old phrase, are they focusing more on carrots or sticks? And I think they're trying to balance that and actually encourage companies to comply, which is why we're going to see extensive guidance from the different country regulators and the European Data Protection Board in its whole over the next year. But we will absolutely see an increase in penalties for certain targeted areas of high concern. We'll probably see that in some areas of big tech, including in particular ad tech, because there is a school of thought which the audience may or may not agree with, but that ad tech sometimes looks like surveillance, and that raises significant concerns in a profiling and fundamental human rights component, which, as I think we understand, underpins the GDPR. So it will be interesting to see what happens, but I would expect some of both. I would expect the guidance to be broad and helpful and detailed. I would expect the penalties to be targeted and focused on some high areas of concern.
Thanks very much, Barbara. So probably just enough time for one question. This is about anonymized data. This one might be good for you, John. Do you see a growing trend towards anonymized data for analytics? And if so, does Looker provide anything for that?
That's a good question again. So I think that is definitely a trend that we're seeing. I think, again, going back to the I suppose the architecture, the data architecture that Looker has, in terms of the ecosystem and so on and so forth. First of all, I suppose because we're in database, ultimately that is our customer's database, right? So we're not extracting data or taking data outside of your organization and putting it somewhere else in the cloud or wherever it might be. So ultimately, every organization controls their data and has ownership of that data, right? So ultimately, Looker is just sitting on top of that data and querying the database. So I think that's for sure one of the ways that we can help our customers and companies that are assessing Looker for that particular requirement. But on that, I'm probably not the most technical person. So if you do want to have more information around something like that, for example, then what I would ask you to do is maybe either connect with me afterwards or contact Looker, and we'll be able to set up a demo, or we'll be able to show you a bit more about how we can address those type of requirements.
Great. Well, thank you very much. There were a number of unanswered questions. However, we will get back to you about those ones if you didn't have your question answered. I would also like to draw your attention to the resource center there. You can find a link to the white paper that John mentioned earlier on in the presentation. You can also find a link there if you're interested in getting more information about a demo from Looker, and a couple of other resources there as well. So I'd invite you to just take a look at that. But that is about all the time we have for today. So I'd like to thank the panelists, Barbara and John. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone took something really useful away from that. And all that is left for me to do is to say thank you to our audience as well for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time here at WBR Insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth.